Hey, everybody. It's a Salt City Hoops podcast. That's Mark over there. I'm Dan. We're going to talk about the Utah Jazz. We're going to talk about the 15 players on standard NBA contracts for the Utah Jazz and try to figure out over the course of a few different podcasts what to expect from them on the good side, on the bad side, fascinating lineup combinations, how much a part of a future they are. Blatantly ripping off Mark's good idea. This whole concept was Mark's idea, and if there's one thing I'm good at, it's taking a good idea and sucking all the life out of it. So that's what we're going to try to do here over the course of the next 3-4 podcasts. Mark, how you doing, Mark Russell Pereira?
I'm doing excellent. I'm happy to try to see if we can give this video idea a call. But if you, we know a lot of you are listening over the airwaves, as it will be, so happy to have you listening to us. And yeah, this is just something as we get into a season for the Jazz where fans and you and me are not particularly looking forward to 40-50 wins in a playoff appearance. It becomes more about the individual players. And there were some unusual signings by the Jazz over the summer. There were some interesting draft picks over the summer. So I felt like it was more fun to help get fans excited about the season, to talk about the actual players and not necessarily the broader landscape of the NBA and the Western Conference and where the Utah Jazz fit into that. And we're going to start out by talking about Lauri Markkanen, but it just has an example of, okay, if Lauri Markkanen is re-signed with this team, that caused kind of consternation across Jazz fans of like, okay, what does that mean for the Jazz future? Well, let's talk about Lauri as a person and how he means for the future of the Jazz, as well as every other player, the rookies, the second-year players, the random veterans we signed in the offseason. And because we can talk about these players forever and ever and ever, I figure we'll do a few podcasts where we drop a few minutes on all of these players and start out with the Jazz best player and Lauri Markkanen. And from there, Dan, we can just jump right into it, I think. What do you say?
Yeah, I think it's great. As you and I were talking as we were planning this thing, it's the Jazz's roster is sort of like naturally tranched anyway into these discrete groups of like veterans who are actually interesting, veterans who are less interesting in the long-term sense, veterans who are who, to your point, just kind of landed here for this season. And then there's the young guys who are kind of lottery talents, high draft picks, and the young guys who are not that, but we'll see. And so we're going to try to kind of take a smattering in each of these next 3 episodes, so that we don't talk about all of the interesting players first and then have a podcast where we just talked about Patty Mills and Svi Mikhailuk for 45 minutes.
I do like
Disrespect
how
to those
you
guys.
started out by saying we have interesting veterans, we have less interesting veterans, and then you got less diplomatic, but you still were extremely diplomatic about the non-interesting veterans on the team. But
How did I say it today? I think I said ill-fitting when we were texting each other.
just players that exist on the team. But even those players, I think it's important that we give fans an insight into why they're here, what they do, and what we can expect from them, and that sort of thing. So jumping right into it, let's start out with Lauri Markkanen, fresh off of a 5-year, $238 million extension given by the Jazz. Lauri cannot be traded this year, just to jump ahead to a future question, but it really does appear that Lauri is here for at least for this year is going to be a non-productive year for the Utah Jazz, but he's healthy. He did not play for Team Finland in Olympic qualifiers, so he has a nice fresh summer where he will come in and hopefully have that shoulder nice and healthy. He looks happy. He's been posting so many fun things about his enjoyment in Utah. So Lauri Markkanen is such an interesting player on a team like the Jazz, where the team is ostensibly perhaps not trying to win, but he is awesome. Unquestionable top 25, top 30 player in the NBA. I think you could go a lot higher than that if you have, when you're talking about roster construction, how malleable his fit is. So one of the first questions I'd like to ask you, Dan, when we talk about each of these players is, what does a good season look like for Lauri Markkanen? And that is almost the hardest question for Lauri, because it is going to be a struggle to identify where Lauri's top ceiling possibly is as a player when he's surrounded by talent that doesn't match his output. So in your opinion, let's start it out by saying, what does a good season for Lauri Markkanen look like for you?
Well, I think it would be easy to say that a good season is just, getting through 82 games without a major injury, because the Jazz are, to your point, probably not focused on the win-loss column that much this year. But having said that, there are a few things that Lauri needs to get better at before the Jazz are ready to get back to being capital C competitive. The two things that come to mind for me are, his growth of being able to just take the ball at the elbow or at the nail and just make something happen. And then the other is obviously, we've talked a lot over the years about the fact that for someone who handles the ball as much as he has, you should almost wind up with 3 or 4 assists per game almost by accident, just because you've got the ball and get, doubles come, whatever, you put the ball on the deck, someone shifts. Like, it's a little weird that his assist average is as low as it has been pretty consistently since Utah made him the main option. Those are two areas where I think Lauri could grow his game, even if the Jazz aren't really super focused on being competitive. And if, because he gets a lot better in those two areas, they accidentally win 31 games instead of 28, I think I can live with that from a draft odds perspective. I do know the Jazz are hoping to come away with a top 5 pick next year, but I don't think they're so all in on that goal that they want Lauri to twiddle his thumbs for the next 8 months. I think they'll be focused on improvement, and those are the two most obvious ways he could improve.
Yeah, we had the same conversation last year about Lauri and passing, right? And we saw Lauri become a lot more comfortable as an isolation ball handler and making plays for himself. And that was a nice little uptick and interesting attitude that he took to his game. And you could attribute the lack of passing to also his teammates as well. And is there movement happening around him, or are we all just standing around watching Lauri do something? And that is something that is going to be a combination of coaching and teammate effort. But also, a lot of that does going to fall onto Lauri as far as passing by accident, right? And in this context especially, you're going to see several more defenses that are loading up, on Lauri. He's going to have to just find the guy who is not being covered. And for the lack of talent on this team, I don't think you can look at this team and say, well, there's a whole bunch of non-shooters out there. Now we have some below average shooters and players that can improve their shooting, but this team has been built, especially with the random nondescript veterans that we've described. This team does have some shooting that will be available, and that's typically the first place you find is just, look, I'm going to throw it to a guy where I think the double team is coming from. And if that leads to a preposterous turnover rate, I'm totally okay with that, as long as we're being coached to say,
Absolutely.
look, just make that play and see what happens, man. Like, if you turn it over and we lose by 5 points, no one's going to hold it against you. And in fact, next year when we're more competitive, it's going to look great. On the flip side, what would be a disappointing season for you?
Well, but before I
Sure.
go there, just to respond to that last point, about not caring about mistakes, I just heard DeMar DeRozan's interview with Brian Windhorst, where he talks about his new book and kind of his mental health journey. And in that podcast, Brian asked him about his time in San Antonio, where just overnight, DeMar DeRozan was averaging 7-8 assists a game. And it turns out that it's because, and I did not know this until listening to this podcast, apparently it's because he got to San Antonio and Pop just told him, hey, for 3.5 quarters of every game, I'm basically going to use you like a point guard. We'll have a nominal point guard on the floor, but you're going to be our primary offensive engine. And then in the last 6 minutes of the game, you just go be DeMar and you cook and you do all the stuff that you do. That's what I'm saying. There's no reason when the Jazz aren't trying to be, capital G good. There's no reason to not just screw around and find out, if that's a skill set he could expand on. So I just wanted to hit that before we rolled on.
That's a great point.
What would be a bad season for him? I mean, I guess the only thing that would make me start to get again, first of all, let's prey on all the things that that nothing happens that impacts his long-term trajectory from an injury standpoint. I guess the only thing that would really make me worry, he had that otherworldly combination in his first Jazz season of scoring volume and efficiency, which was really uncommon. Like he was up there with 3 or 4 of the NBA's top superstars in terms of points per game and true shooting. And that was obviously a season where he played most of the year with Mike Conley, and the ecosystem was a little different. Mike left. The Jazz came back with, another sort of flawed roster for last season. But Lauri's efficiency and scoring volume largely held up. And that to me is really impressive, because he did that on a team that did not have a true point guard. And had a bunch of people that were sort of being asked to wear a point guard costume for Halloween. So I guess, if he had a major backslide in terms of efficiency, as to your point, he just has less around him to distract defenses. I guess that would make me start to rethink what I've been saying all along about Lauri's sort of ceiling. I think his ceiling is really high. I think, the one year where he played half a season with a real ass point guard, he finished that season 17th in All NBA voting. He was 2 spots out of All NBA voting. So, if you put a real ass roster around him, a real ass point guard next to him, he's already not that far from All NBA. He's not that far from being a top 15 player. And then, you factor in growth and whatever, could this be someone that you're talking about as a top 10 to 12 player? And then after that, you're in the realm of guys who are on MVP ballots. And so I think that he does have, he wouldn't have to improve that much to start getting in that really rarefied air, but that's only if he can show us that sort of that efficiency can hold up. So bad season probably is, him taking a 5 to 6 percentage point hit on true shooting.
The efficiency thing is where I land as well. But more specifically, I get concerned not about the 3-point shooting, because if that falters because he's getting loaded up on his open shots aren't quite as prevalent. It's more that we were all surprised 2 years ago as to how physically dominant Lauri Markkanen was around the rim and drawing free throws, and that got even better as his Jazz seasons went on. And there are a lot of reasons that Lauri Markkanen can just not care this year, right? And being physically dominant around the rim and drawing free throws requires one to really care. And luckily, Lauri Markkanen appears to be wired like those insane athletes that will absolutely give 148% regardless of the team construct and whatever, and that's why you have to quote-unquote shut a guy down despite him being at 98% health, because he's not going to slow down in the sake of preserving his body. But that being said, I can see how an entire season of the team not winning could affect his ability to get around the rim and draw those free throws. That is a major part of what makes him such an efficient player, is hitting those free throws and drawing lots of fouls. And some of the more struggling Jazz games last year was when Lauri somehow only had 2 free throw attempts. And pretty much every time that he got 10, 11, 12, 14 free throw attempts, it was a very competitive game against a very good team that either the Jazz won or they came close to winning against competitive teams. That's where I care about the efficiency. And so if we're seeing an entire season of Lauri not getting free throw attempts, that would be concerning to me as some sort of portending a long-term issue, because I don't think it'll be an effort-based thing. I think that'll be something to do with what happened to this physicality that we saw over the past 2 years. Because if he takes a dip in 3-point shooting or whatever, if he takes a dip in mid-range 2-point shooting, I don't really care. It's going to be more about his ability to finish at the rim, converting those rim opportunities, and drawing free throws. I think that would be a problematic season if those levels do not continue. Other than that, it's all upside from there for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to build on that point, his field goal percentage at the rim did hold up last season. It was 72% rounded in each of the last 2 seasons. So that's just a really great finishing percentage. His short mid-range was 50% in each of the last 2 seasons. His longer, his 10 points, but 10 beyond 10 feet, but not yet a 3-pointer. That percentage dropped a little bit last year. I really don't care. That's not the area where I think his game is built. Long mid-range was only 3% of his shot diet. And then his 3-point efficiency did hold up, 39.1% in his first Jazz season, 39.9% last year. So like, to me, that's great. His shot diet has been pretty consistent. He's still taking almost half of his shots as threes. I think that's what he should be doing, but he also shouldn't be afraid to attack the paint with abandon, which was, to your point, one of the most fun parts of watching his explosion onto the scene in that most improved player season.
His dunk over Rudy Gobert will always remain my favorite. Just the wild moment of, what do we have here? And I know his dunk over Nikola Vucevic is probably a better quote, like, dunk over a guy, but that dunk on Rudy Gobert in the first couple weeks of the season was, especially because of who it was against, it really enlightened, I think, everybody to say that this is a new Lauri Markkanen that we did not expect, and that's a guy that makes me excited to build around, not just like this perimeter scoring threat that I think people attribute his game to. It's really an interior threat as well that makes me excited. So, Dan,
he's mean to the rim. He's mean. That's the thing about it, too. But
I have a phrase I use on Twitter that I will not repeat here that describes how I think of players like that. But yeah, I'm excited to see Lauri just for the season. Look, if you're playing fantasy, I can guarantee you he's not going to play the last 20 games of the season. Might as well book that. But he's a rock solid guy to keep for your dynasty leagues, because he is the real deal, and he will be playing for the Jazz next year for sure. I should never say for sure, but like, he is a part of the Jazz future and seems to have all the tools to be a successful player going forward. So I'm not worried if he only plays 50, 60 games this year. It's more about what he does with those 50, 60 games on top of that. But when he is playing, Dan, the next question I want to ask about each of our players on the roster is, what lineup do you most want to see Lauri Markkanen play with? Now, you don't necessarily... I'm not asking you to necessarily give a 5-man lineup, but please provide one if you do have one, but also just the player or players that you most want to see Lauri Markkanen grow chemistry with, or what do you want them to experiment with, or how successful do you think the team can be if Lauri's playing with XYZ players?
Yeah, I think still one of the reasons I like Lauri is because I think he is super legit as a 3 and a 4, and a small ball 5, but I think that's more gimmicky than, something that you want to make a steady diet of. So for me, it's less about putting him in a specific spot in the depth chart. I think that how he plays moving forward with Walker Kessler is super duper relevant. The Jazz are not. Somehow it got in people's heads that the Jazz are frustrated with Kessler or ready to move on from Kessler, or that Kessler's butted heads with the wrong people in practice, and I don't think that that's true, or better said, I think that's exaggerated. I don't think the Jazz are at all ready to move on from Kessler. My intel says the Jazz have talked to probably 2/3 of the league on Walker Kessler, and if they wanted to get rid of him, they would have by now. So I think Kessler's important, and I think that's a player that, seeing how that interplay works, informs a lot of roster construction. If you do think that Walker Kessler is someone who's going to be a 10-year starter in the NBA. And then I'm actually kind of sneaky interested. I'm kind of intrigued by Cody Williams at a level that might be unhealthy with 0 NBA games played. And so I do kind of want to see if that works too. I should be more interested in Hendricks, because again, Hendricks is another guy who's kind of a flex 3-4. He's not really either position, but he's, but he can play both. So, that's probably more interesting as a Swiss Army thing, where you just, every trip down the floor, the defensive assignments could look different. But I'm interested to see, and we'll talk more about Cody Williams in a later episode. I'm interested to see, number one, is he good? Does he have a chance to be 85% of what his brother Jalen is for OKC? But I'm also interested to see if there's any sort of chemistry there with Lauri and Williams. And I mostly went with those two guys because I know you're going to go somewhere else. So let's hear your answer to that question.
Well, for me, it's all about identifying a lineup that we could see in the playoffs in 2 years. And there's a very real idea that Colin Sexton, Keontae George, Cody Williams, Lauri Markkanen, and Walker Kessler is a playoff lineup in 2 years. Specifically, I'm curious about the Sexton Markkanen thing. I think their chemistry has been quite muted over the past couple years. I think there's more to explore there. But in particular, Keontae George has way more upside than Colin Sexton. I think he's got a long ways to go to even get to where Colin Sexton is right now, and there's a possibility he never even gets to Colin Sexton's current level, and Sexton had a remarkable year last year. Not an all-star year, and Sexton's himself has a long way to go. But the biggest upside we're seeing there is Keontae George and Lauri Markkanen. Is that your Darren Williams and Carlos Boozer, right? Like, is that your next iteration of just all-star guard, scorer, ball handler, passer, and dominant inside-out forward threat, right? And Carlos Boozer playing in a different era with that hingy jump shot. Maybe that could have extended to a three-point range in a different era. But that's kind of what I see as like, okay, is this the next thing, right? Because Keontae George did give us quite a bit to get excited about in his rookie year. And very much like Darren Williams, who had a successful rookie season, we saw like, okay, maybe it wasn't the stats on the page weren't magnificent, but we saw a little bit that of what Darren can do. And I'm excited to see what Keontae George can do. And if he's got a dependent threat like Lauri Markkanen that he can rely on we saw so many of those excellent pocket passes, the fast break passes to Markkanen were extremely good, and just how that sort of pick and roll game or dribble handoff game can possibly work. Those are two guys I really want to see interplay with each other, and the lineup specifically adding the defensive potential of Kessler and Cody Williams. And the reason I'm saying Cody Williams is because I saw just enough to Taylor Hendricks, which we'll talk about in a short moment, to not be super excited about Hendricks' future. But Cody Williams is just, well, he could be anything. He could even be a Taylor Hendricks. And that's where I kind of line as far as a five-man lineup. But when we do talk about Sexton and Keontae George, I'm going to talk more about the interplay of those two guards. But when I think about the playoff lineup 2 years from now, that five-man lineup is what I'm most excited about because of the two star-level potential players that we have there, and the current star in Lauri and the best chance of a future star in Keontae George of those five.
Yeah, I mean, I have more thoughts there, and they might make more sense. There are really more thoughts about Keontae George, so it might make more sense to save them for then. I guess high level, what I would say, because this ties back to the big questions about Lauri, I think that because there are things we still don't know about sort of what Keontae can be as a playoff team's lead offensive generator. Again, a role he never had until he was thrust into it for 50 games last season on a bad team or a non-competitive team. So I do think that there's still a very valid question about like whether or not he's an actual point guard, whatever that means, or an actual lead guard. And so I do think that the question gets about their interplay going into the future is interesting unto itself, but it's also interesting because you almost can't answer it without figuring out, is Lauri going to be more of a creator than he is today? Because I mean, you know, one thing that I was thinking about as we were getting ready for this that I haven't said out loud yet, so if this is stupid, I guess we'll just find out together that this is stupid. But like, you know, Lauri is, I think, unquestionably a better player today than peak Gordon Hayward when Gordon Hayward was a Jazz All-Star. And yet Gordon Hayward, that version of Gordon Hayward, was miles ahead of where Lauri Markkanen is today in terms of self-creation. And I do think that kind of matters if you're expecting him to be the best or second best player on a team that's going to like actually do stuff in 2 to 3 years. And again, I bring it up here because it matters in the context of if he's going to do more of that, then maybe it doesn't matter if Keontae George is ever going to be a 9-assist guy. Like, you know what I mean? So I don't know if that's useful or germane to the conversation, but I just thought about that Hayward linkage today. I'm really excited about Markkanen. I just a few minutes ago basically said on this podcast that I don't think he's that far from like back into the MVP ballot type range in the NBA if you get a real point guard next to him. But again, to me, the question about him and Keontae is Keontae that point guard, or is Keontae going to continue to be like a Devin Booker style? And by the way, Devin Booker's gotten pretty damn good. Like, he kind of shut up a lot of the Phoenix needs a point guard question by essentially converting himself into a point guard on the fly. but he's still sort of a shooting guard who handles the ball a lot more than he's just a natural creator. And we'll see if that matters to Keontae's future, or if it matters less because Lauri starts doing stuff, or because they get a Cooper Flag or an Ace or a Traore or a whoever in next year's draft, and that kind of answers that need.
Yeah, it's if you think about going back to the first question of like what is a good season for Lauri Markkanen, we're not expecting it this season, but if you're looking at this lineup outlook and how he plays with a guy like Keontae George or Colin Sexton, it's you're always going to look for what is a player of Lauri Markkanen's archetype that would be a Hall of Fame trajectory, right? If he's going to continue this. And the obvious natural thing is going to be Dirk Nowitzki, right? Where Dirk Nowitzki was a dependent threat for the majority of possessions that he played, right? He had a wonderful face-up game. He absolutely have the ball on the floor himself and do his own thing. But that title team, Jason Terry and Jason Kidd, adding those elements to that team and playing alongside Tyson Chandler, like that created the title-winning team that extrapolated from Nowitzki's prior MVP winning seasons, right? Or season. And that's what I'm looking at when I'm surrounding Lauri with a lineup that is not necessarily to maximize Lauri Markkanen, but to maximize the future of the Utah Jazz. Because I think any pretty good point guards are going to be able to play alongside Lauri Markkanen and make him play better. But where can we really get that extra juice? And that is frankly hoping that playing alongside Walker Kessler, as you mentioned, and Keontae George, if those players can get elevated by playing alongside Lauri, now we're cooking with gas for a potential competitive team for the future. And speaking of future competitive teams, what I'd like to ask for every player on this series is a pair of related questions, which is, will this player survive the trade deadline this year? But more broadly speaking, will they be part of the Jazz next title run? As I prefaced, Lauri Markkanen cannot be traded this year, so I do not want to ask...
easy button.
I'm sorry, you said the easy button?
Easy button. Yeah, we don't know that. We can skip that one for Lauri.
And yes. I don't even want to ask the question of like, well, if he signed a contract early, what do you think he could have been? No, he's not going to get traded. Let's not think about it. Is he part of the Jazz next top 2, top 4 in the West title run? And I think we have to look at that as more of like a 4 years from now type of consideration. And I'll take this one first because I've kind of asked all these questions and forced you to answer first. His age curve is tremendous, and I think the Jazz have so many draft picks that we're going to be able to cash in. And I have a sneaking suspicion that after this year, those draft picks will become more trade assets than not. We've seen the Oklahoma City model where they keep churning in young players and creating a nice cost-efficient roster around them, but it really helps when a guy like Chet Holmgren can come in the second season that he's on his contract after missing his first year due to injury, of course, and being an immediate starter-level contributor. Like, that just rarely happens in the NBA. So the Oklahoma City Thunder just continue to get lucky and lucky and lucky. So I don't think Utah can look at that model and be and just follow it. Like, you have to nail the draft picks, and even if you don't nail them, they have to be good draft picks that contribute in 2-3 years. So you have to hope that Hendricks or Cody Williams will be useful, or Isaiah Collier or Filipowski or whatever, that they will be useful in a couple years. But right now, this team is quite devoid of other players like Lauri Markkanen. Is Colin Sexton going to continue to be useful in 4 years? I really don't know. Or are we simply in this weird Andrei Kirilenko era where Lauri Markkanen is obviously very good, and the team is making some quality draft picks around them, but by the time you draft your Darren Williams or you sign your Carlos Boozer, that Kirilenko is more of a tertiary or quaternary piece to your team rather than being that. And Lauri Markkanen will be around for 5 years, or at least that's what is, or more than that with the extension. That's what it should be. I think he is such a malleable player, and with the salary cap, I'm taking a roundabout way of this, I'm sorry, but because he's such a malleable player and because of the salary cap is going up, that his contract will look quite reasonable going on, is I think in 3, 4, 5 years, Lauri Markkanen will definitely still be a Jazz man, and I think he will definitely not be the best player on the team. So I think he will be part of the next Jazz title run, but not in the way that we've been talking about him for the past 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think he could be 1B, 2A on the next contending version of the Jazz. I guess here's the thing. If we're going to really oversimplify the plan, and I hate the term "the plan" because it connotes that there's only one outcome that Danny Ainge and Justin Zanuck and Ryan Smith have in mind, and I think that that's really that's not how the NBA works. But in the roughest outlines of what a plan feels like, I think that the Jazz's idea is that their next kind of three-headed monster, their next core that they're going to build around is Lauri, whoever they draft in 2025, and whoever they eventually go pounce and get from kind of that borderline all-star tier in the trade market who becomes, I mean, they would also take Giannis if he became available, but let's pretend that they're not getting Giannis and they're not getting Luka and they're not getting Shea. Then you're kind of you're going like sort of down that list further. And that's probably what they're hoping is going to happen to kind of populate the next core. Lauri, a stud in the draft, and a stud that they go trade for with all their million draft assets. And then everything else becomes an exercise of, okay, well, how useful is Cody Williams? How useful is Keontae George? How useful is Taylor Hendricks, Walker Kessler, et cetera, around that three-man sort of entity? And so yeah, I mean, I don't know yet if Lauri is going to be the best Jazz player in 3 to 4 years. We should probably be hoping not. We should probably be hoping as fans that they get someone who does change the pecking order. But if we're talking about a future where Lauri does get a little bit better, and now he's firmly in kind of the top 12 to 15 conversation among NBA players, and they get, I'm making this up, VJ Edgecombe, and they get, I don't know who's, I like the name Jaden McDaniels. I've said Jaden McDaniels a lot. Whatever, if they get kind of another borderline all-star or all-defense guy to play next to Lauri and their stud draft pick, then in that scenario, I don't think they necessarily have to have a top 5 player to be, really good. But so yeah, my short answer to this question is yes. I think absolutely Lauri is going to be part of this team when they start to become good again. I think how quickly they do that determines, exactly what his patience looks like over the next couple of years. But obviously, he knew what he knew when he decided to delay signing his extension so that he could force himself to stay in Salt Lake City. So he does want to be here, even understanding what the immediate term future looks like. So I think, to me, that's pretty exciting. The Jazz have a couple of guys on their roster who are good young veterans in Lauri Markkanen and Colin Sexton, who both, I'm going to say this slowly because it matters, chose to be here. Collins chose to be here because he was a sign and trade. He was part of that Donovan trade, but he had to agree. He had to put his name on a piece of paper that said, I'm going to play for the Utah Jazz. And Lauri Markkanen chose to be here by engineering his extension signing the way he did. And I think that that's really cool. And I think that matters. And obviously Markkanen's a better candidate to be part of the long-term future than Sexton. But I still think it's cool that both guys at this juncture in their career, coming from where they've come from, both actively chose the Utah Jazz as, the place they wanted to develop this next phase of their careers.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that when I kind of formulated these questions, and I think that's a really important point to close on with Lauri Markkanen, is that as you have a rebuilding team that is trying to figure out their way over the next 3-4 years, the common thing you'll see on Twitter replies or throughout the zeitgeist is, well, why the hell does he want to play there? I don't know, man. Like, sometimes people just like being in a place, right? Right. Whether they like the stars and the excitement of Los Angeles, or they like New York City, or they like Chicago, or they're playing in their hometown, right? Maybe they are playing for a place like the Cleveland Cavaliers or something, where they just like kind of being there and that team. Turns out Utah, the city of Utah, if you will, is a great fit for Lauri Markkanen and his family and his background and where he likes to be. It really helps that he has a great bond with his coach already that seems to identify like, hey, even if we're struggling, like this guy is going to make me better as a person and a player. That means a lot to me. That it got me $240 million, right? Like there is already something that Utah has done for me that I'm willing to do. It's not necessarily like, yes, all these guys are wired to just win a title. Yes, win, win, win. That is absolutely a priority. But they're also not stupid, and they also have families. And we can be confident that Lauri will be part of the next contender because he wants to be here for all of the underlying meaty reasons that unless Will Hardy gets fired or there's some underlying turmoil that will make Lauri reconsider what he likes about the area or what he likes about the team, nothing is going to change in 3 or 4 years for those underlying reasons that he likes to be here. Mm-hmm. And regardless if he's the first best player on the team or if I'm suggesting maybe he's not, maybe he's more like the 4th or 5th best player in 4 or 5 years if things go right. I don't know. It's more because he's malleable on the court. He loves being in Utah, and it doesn't seem like a guy that you need to immediately trade to the Golden State Warriors for 1.5 draft picks just because you need to bottom out to 12 wins. So Lauri, very excited to see him. One of my very favorite Jazz men I've ever seen play. He's only played for Utah for 2 years. I really want to see him play in his first ever playoff game in his entire career someday. As a Jazz man, and just excited to see his growth with Utah. We've seen a lot of great players grow in Utah. I want to see him actually succeed. So from there, we spent a long time talking about Lauri Markkanen because he's deserved of the time it's spent. But the way we're going to break these up is we're going to have one kind of bright star or like starter level player or exciting prospect to talk about and really get into the meat of it, but we also want to cover every player so that the fans are prepared. We'll talk about one,
and if we spend that amount of time talking about Johnny Juzang or Isaiah Collier, someone needs to like check us into some sort of facility.
Yeah, I think my wife is pretty close to that already. But I think that we do have still a lot of interesting players left to go. So let's talk a little bit about Taylor Hendricks in his second year at the Utah Jazz. A lottery pick last year, lots of time in the G League with some up and down G League performances, and then got quite a bit of burn with the Utah Jazz on the main club towards the end of the season, but kind of a flexible, sometimes he was starting, sometimes he was playing, sometimes he was playing well, sometimes he was very much not playing well. So I have a lot of questions about Taylor Hendricks, but I think they're easy answers to prognosticate. So let's start with the easy one. What does a good season look like for you for Taylor Hendricks this year?
It's mostly about defense still, I think. He had some halves of games where he looked like a potential game changer. And then, great players did what great players do, and they kind of solved him. We could talk about like the Luka game where he really frustrated Luka for a half, and then Luka went like, yeah, I'm Luka Doncic and you're a rookie, and so guess how this is going to go from here on out. That's fine. I'd like to see him be able to hold his own a little bit more in those situations. He shot 38% from 3 last year. I think that's an important number in that it keeps him on the floor. He was a little better than that actually from catch and shoot, which is important, but frankly, he could shoot 35% from 3 next season, and I wouldn't care because if the defense is still coming along, then he still has a pretty safe avenue to being a 10-year NBA pro if he can just guard the way we've seen him guard in specific situations. And the fact that he can guard ball handlers and bigger bodies, I think makes him really valuable. I hate the term 3-and-D because it's again just overly simplistic, but that's sort of the promise or the hope with him is that he's someone who comes in with his size and fills an archetype that every NBA team wants more of. And maybe that is helpful to the Jazz because they use him on the basketball court. And maybe that's helpful to the Jazz because at some point he becomes so valuable in a marketplace that currently has a dearth of, big bodied defensive wings that they cash in on him. And I think either answer is fine. But yeah, for me, I just kind of want to see the defense come along and become a little more solid. Like, a lot of the times he was making the wrong read on defense, but still recovering because he's a freakish athlete and he has incredible length. I'd like to see what happens if he gets disciplined enough that he can just like bottle up a guy for a possession or two. And to me that's a pretty interesting player, which is why I was a little surprised to hear you say that you're kind of more bearish on him. I'm not. I don't think he's like future All NBA or anything like that. But I can see a pathway for him to being, a guy who starts or is a high-level bench player for the next 6 to 8 years if that defense just solidifies.
Yeah, I think my bearishness comes from what we saw from a lottery pick, insofar as he's a very late bloomer. Playing for Central Florida, it was kind of a surprise, like, wait, where did this guy come from? And he had a lot of opportunity at Central Florida to do kind of whatever he wanted offensively and defensively. So when you're looking at his prospect idea, you're thinking not just 3-and-D, you're thinking, I don't know, maybe he can figure out how to dribble a little bit. Like, he really hasn't learned how to play formal basketball yet. And watching his G League tape and watching what he was doing in the NBA, it's like, oh, he's never going to have that skill. And that was disappointing for me, is to say, like, all right, we are really talking about a guy that if he does have some sort of dribbling ability or passing ability or wild untapped potential, it's going to happen like 7 years from now and not something that is going to happen like in the next 4 years on his rookie contract that you're kind of building around. But the skills he does have are worth talking about. And a good season for him, yeah, it is defensively, and it is a much higher volume of three-point shooting and more confident three-point shooting. I don't care if the percentage goes down. I want to see the volumes go way up. Just shoot, buddy. If the ball touches your hand, I want it jacked up, and I want you to have the confidence to shoot over people with your height. And defensively, the nuances of NBA defense, and especially that one-on-one lockdown defense, is going to take time. Team defense is wildly difficult, and that's why even with having Walker Kessler, we can talk about his up and down season, whatever. Having a guy that quality behind you as a rim protector can help you learn the nuances a little bit of team defense. If you give a shit, I think is also a big part of it. And another part of my bearishness is look, I'm a dumb fan sitting here watching all these games on TV, so you can't read too much into it, but he is very much an aloof personality. And when you have some of this defensive minded person that you want to be just a nightmare to deal with if you're a ball handler or if you're an opposing offense, sometimes we get sucked into a little too early onto Jared Vanderbilt type energy where we're like, oh, look at that guy flying around the court. Yeah. And then it takes you an entire season to realize that guy is actually very bad defensively. The energy just looks good. So it's hard for me as a fan to sort of parse that out sometimes, but the
Damari Carroll principle.
Yes, Damari Carroll, junkyard dog, right? Like there is a fan appeal to defense when it looks like a guy is trying hard, and I just don't think we've seen enough from Taylor Hendricks in his NBA season thus far to say like, well, what is your impact defensively, right? Can we gobble up more rebounds? Can we really have more of those shutdown moments on one-on-one opportunities? Because team defense is something you really can't figure out until like the next day when you watch the tape or what have you. And in the moment you can watch if a guy gets lost or whatever. So it is also defensively for me, but I'm curious to see if I notice Taylor Hendricks more defensively this year. And that would be a successful season for me.
That's fair. And so I think talking through it, we're closer aligned than I thought we might be. I think to me it just comes down to the question of like, is the hope for him, Jeremy Grant light? Because if that's in that regard, I think we'll be disappointed. If the hope is Jonathan Isaac light, like that's still pretty interesting, even though again, you wouldn't want Jonathan Isaac ever dribbling the ball 3 consecutive times. So yeah. I think we're kind of in the same range on him. What would you call a bad season?
A bad season is Taylor Hendricks can't see the floor. I think there is a world where he is completely not able to be trusted when the Jazz have their full complement of players. This roster is currently set up with John Collins and Jordan Clarkson still on the team, where Taylor Hendricks will have to earn a roster, like earn minutes here a little bit. He will be slated to obviously get minutes and might even start over John Collins if that's the direction the Jazz take. But if he has a bad camp and he plays poorly while John Collins is still on the team, there is a route that he doesn't see the floor. Maybe Cody Williams is playing well. Drew Eubanks and Walker Kessler will split time. Lauri Markkanen is here. There is a world, and we have these guards that all kind of need to see the floor. Like if Isaiah Collier really hits, right? He, Sexton, Clarkson, and Keontae George all need to see the floor in some respect, right? There is a world, even though that the Jazz have no small forwards on the roster, practically, after offloading Fontecchio, that Taylor Hendricks is only seeing the floor by default and not because you want him to be. And there could be some DNPs in certain situations while John Collins is still on the roster. That's a bad season. That means he can't be trusted on a team that desperately needs anything from someone of his size and capability. That's a terrible season.
Yeah, I would agree. Lineups I most want to see Hendricks in. I'm moving down the list.
Sure.
Again, if we do 40 minutes on each guy, then people's ears will bleed. It's funny. Normally with these young guys, you would want to see them with lineups that allow them to kind of feature their NBA skill and next to guys who kind of mitigate their weaknesses. I say screw it. I kind of want to see Hendricks with like just a super defensive lineup. I want to see what happens when he plays with, when he plays next to Kessler for sure. I don't even know who the Jazz's best guard defender is right now. Probably Sexton, although Sexton falls a little bit into that Damari Carroll, Jay Crowder. Is he actually good or does he just slap the floor a lot category? But I mean, Sexton tries, which is, I guess, the point. Sexton is also the player on this team who is the most likely to like flap the floor and scream and then get beat from a standstill without a screen. But anyway, we're not doing Colin Sexton right now. I just kind of want to see if I want to see him in environments where the Jazz can trot out a lineup for, 6 to 8 minutes of a game and have a D rating of like 60 just to see if that's in the realm of possibility, partially because they were so bad collectively on defense last season. But again, because I think Hendricks' clearest path to being, a good NBA team's top 7 of their rotation is closer to the Jonathan Isaac mold than to the guy who you ask to do really anything on offense other than catch and shoot and maybe occasionally attacking a poor closeout. So I just think it would be cool to see him in some of those, like, go ahead, we dare you to try to score on us lineups.
Yeah, in the same vein, I want to see the swarm of arms. Insert point guard, Cody Williams, Taylor Hendricks, Lauri Markkanen, and John Collins. I want to see a switchable swarm of arms, just nightmare defense to play against. This assumes a lot of things. This assumes John Collins recovers some sort of his defensive ability in playing the 5 and what he saw in Atlanta 3 years ago at this point that kind of made him a little successful in that role. Lauri Markkanen, competent defender, and if he can be kind of switchable because the other guys he's playing with is Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks, which another assumption, those guys are good defensively. Cody Williams isn't going to be good defensively right off the gate, but if you simplify the game for Hendricks and you simplify the game for Cody Williams and just putting him in a switch everything type of defense, that can be like a weird, fun defense to say, like, we don't really know what we're doing, but we can just switch everything. And every time you feel like you got an advantage because Taylor Hendricks got lost or John Collins doesn't know what he's doing, well, here's somebody with a 100-foot arm blocking something out of nowhere and can really confuse them. And even if you're not switching everything, maybe you go zone with a lineup like that, right? And if you're doing some sort of zone style, maybe you prefer to have Kessler in there as well, but maybe an inverted zone if you're having those there's a lot of weird things you can do if Cody Williams is your second tallest or your second shortest player. Really cool thing you can do there. I think Taylor Hendricks will survive the trade deadline. I think it would be a weird situation where he wouldn't. And part of the next title run, kind of defend. He's he's going to be in that quality of player, right? Where the salary slot he commands when he enters restricted free agency in 4 years, that is often a very challenging player to build around your salary cap. He's a player you want to keep around. If all your draft picks are hitting, you can just say, sure, yeah, we'll give you, X% of the cap and go from there. But if he is a tier above that and he's actually really quality, but would make it a struggle to extend the other guys that are younger and perhaps better, he could be somebody that you offload before restricted free agency. But this is assuming a whole lot about what Taylor Hendricks' future looks like. But it seems like because he's not going to ever have that star level potential, that his best path to being on the next title team is to be a starter level defender type player. And if he's better than that, I actually think it might actually hurt his chances on sticking around, because it might hurt sort of the salary structure, if that makes sense to you.
It does. And also, if we go back to what we think the Jazz are going to try to accomplish at the macro level, which is, again, Lauri, draft well, and at some point go get another star or borderline star. Like, if you're going to go make a run at a top 20 to 30 NBA player in the trade market, you're going to have to put useful stuff in that trade package. So, the reality is that some of these guys are going to be footnotes to history, right? Like, when the Jazz traded for Mike Conley, they gave up Grayson Allen, who was a recent first round pick. When the Jazz go down the line, you don't unlock that level without giving up something that you're uncomfortable giving up. And obviously the Jazz are going to start those phone conversations by saying, hey, we want player X, but you're not getting Lauri and you're not getting whoever we drafted in 2025. And that's a tough negotiating position to start from. So when the third guy on their list is, well, okay, we want Cody Williams, or we want Taylor Hendricks, or we want Keontae, like, you got to at least seem like you're listening, or else the phone conversation gets pretty short. So that's another thing to consider with all these guys who are, like, might be good in 3 to 4 years, but they might still not be like core level good.
And something we talked about a lot with Lauri Markkanen's extension talks and all that is you don't build from your first best player, then you get your second best player, then you get your third best player. You don't build like that. You build with the guys you have and the opportunities that present themselves. To your point about a plan, like, you don't necessarily have a plan. It's more about, all right, what avenues do we have with the players on roster? And it's possible that Taylor Hendricks ends up being the Utah Jazz 7th best player on a title team 5 years from now.
Right.
See what we got. And if he is incredible, well, maybe he's useful in a trade for something else, or maybe he is part of the third or fourth best player on a title team. So from there, we get into a lot of guys that we have a lot of questions about because we've never seen them. Let's talk about Drew Eubanks, Dan, who is signed, who is the very first free agent signing of the Jazz this summer. While all the free agency news was spinning and everyone was excited about players that were getting signed and who was going where, and the Jazz had the most salary cap room in the entire NBA, they made a giant splash, and they immediately, I think it was the second or first day of free agency, signing Drew Eubanks as a backup center for 2 years, $10 million, second year non-guaranteed. Backup center. Not a lot to get super jazzed up about, but what do you think is a good season, or what do you like about Drew Eubanks that he's going to provide?
Well, and honestly, maybe third string center, because, like, John Collins is still on this roster, and I don't think the Jazz believe that Walker Kessler and John Collins are going to play side by side a lot, which means by definition you're splitting those two guys up. And so unless you're giving John Collins 0 minutes, which I would be surprised about, like, Drew Eubanks is kind of waiting for table scraps for, at least until some kind of roster movement happens. So, that's interesting. Now, what the Jazz did to get Drew Eubanks to say yes to them is they threw probably more cash at him than anyone else was throwing his way. I think he was probably a minimum level signing, and the Jazz went significantly above that in exchange for a shorter contract with a non-guaranteed second year, so that they have, the optionality if he's useful to keep around next year, but they also have the option of, telling him thanks and good luck next summer. I think I'm anxious to hear you cook, so I don't want to go too long on Drew Eubanks because I know you have thoughts. I think that the thing that Eubanks will give the Jazz is he's probably the only player on the roster who, like, opposing teams are going to go, oh shit, Drew Eubanks just checked in. Like, he's going to elbow me, he's going to bump me, he's going to talk to me, he's going to, he's going to try to start a fight over every stupid little thing. Like, he's that guy in pickup who you're just like, oh, that dude's here this week. Like, oh, it's going to be kind of a slog. Like, there's some value in that. I don't know that it's like, I don't know that it does more than just make him this like cute mascot-y kind of fun dude that we're all going to like get amped up when he gets in someone's face, and when he protects his point guard by like going and telling, Lou Dort, hey, don't push my guy, like whatever. Like, I think there's value in it, but it's mostly theatrical value. But like, hey, I'm here for it because the Jazz don't have a lot of that attitude.
Well, that's exactly it. The Jazz have none of that attitude, right? So if we're looking at the team last year, the vocal leaders on the team were John Collins and Chris Dunn. And John Collins is still around. He's still going to be a vocal leader, for better or worse. But Chris Dunn, losing Chris Dunn is a massive voice that you're losing as far as give a shit level when your team's not winning. Right, he's gonna jazz you up. He's gonna really juice you up and really feel like, hey, you care this much, I care this much too. Like, let's go to battle today. We're 20-43, and that having the broader point I want to make about Drew Eubanks is when you are, and we'll talk about this with Patty Mills as well when we get to later episode. When you have a young team, it is so underrated how important it is to have good habits be instilled in training camp, in practice. We all talk about good locker room guys. We all talk about having good guys on the airplane to play cards with and be friends, and maybe guide them in the right places and have them pick out good houses and good off the court habits. But I think on the court, when you're practicing, yeah, Patty Mills might not be a bomber like he used to be, and Drew Eubanks, his rim protection numbers started out actually pretty impressive in Portland and San Antonio for a guy of his ilk, and didn't really do a whole lot. They kind of slipped a little bit in Phoenix last year, but having a guy who can shoot a little bit like Patty Mills, or a guy who can set screens and defend like Drew Eubanks in practice consistently throughout the roster, that is going to train everyone who plays around him, specifically the point guards or the centers who are playing with those guys, to learn how to play NBA basketball. Whereas a guy like Omer Yurtseven, who was a nice signing last year as the third center, to say like, hey, Yurtseven is kind of showing a little bit as in Miami as a terrific rebounder. Let's see if we can get more out of Yurtseven to be a quality center, right? Maybe he is part of will be on the Jazz for 4 or 5 years. Let's try to develop him. That is not the case with Eubanks. Eubanks is not going to develop. He's not going to improve, and you're not expecting him to. You want him to be exactly what he is right now and provide a lot of the juice in practice and in training camp, and get everyone to care a little bit more on a team that might not do it. Note that Will Hardy coached Drew Eubanks in San Antonio when Hardy was with the Spurs, and it's a player that on the court, the one thing he is going to provide best for improvement across the roster is he is going to teach Walker Kessler how to set nasty screens. And that's what I want to see. And I'm not talking about illegal screens, and maybe I am talking about illegal screens, but
illegal adjacent.
Yeah. Look, I'm a lawyer, not a cop. I'm not going to talk about what is legal and not legal, perhaps. And if I can never see Walker Kessler do the whole point his thumb in the direction of where the screen is being sent, so his point guard, like whatever youth basketball coach taught Kessler to do that, I think should be put in jail. And I think Drew Eubanks can more effectively be in practice and kind of say like, hey, these are the tricks that I've learned in my 7 years in the NBA on how to set a good screen for Keontae George. Right, and kind of teaching that aspect of it. And if Kessler's not up to the task on a random game, all right, tossing Eubanks in there, and we know that maybe good things will happen for the offense or defense, just for particular play types. So, and a bad season for him is just like, he can't move. He can't provide any defense. And if he is completely useless defensively, it really hampers all the things that I'm trying to say. Is like, okay, maybe his rim protection numbers that went down in Phoenix last year, if that continues, and he becomes unplayable, now we got some problems because we don't really have anyone behind Eubanks either. Two-way guys, Micah Potter and Oscar Shibue. Yes, they're big men, but they're not rim protecting big men, so really can struggle defensively if Eubanks can't stay on the floor defensively either.
Yeah, I have very little opinion on what I think a good or a bad season is for Eubanks. I personally don't care a whole lot if he plays the 1,100 minutes he played last year or if he plays 500 minutes or whatever. I do think that Jazz fans will just like him because he'll be another one of those guys who will come in and not really give a shit about who he's talking to or who he's mixing it up with. He's not really afraid of anybody, and I know fans like that. But yeah, I think in terms of lineups, like he's someone who I would actually like to see play with John Collins, which is funny because I think John Collins is like really the thing that's standing in the way of Eubanks playing a major role on next year's Jazz team. And maybe the Jazz will eventually find a place for Collins or not. I don't know. We'll talk about that in the Collins episode. But I just, because the Jazz have concluded maybe prematurely or maybe not, that Collins and Kessler is just an ill fit and that you can't really play those guys together. I do think then the next corollary is, okay, can Collins play power forward next to a different type of center who is himself not really like a lane clogging big butt. I just think that would be interesting to see him play a little bit with Collins. But again, I don't know. I don't know that I have strong opinions on exact combinations of guys I want to see next to Eubanks. Do you?
Yeah, I mainly care about the screening aspect, and with how fast Colin Sexton is and how much guile he really improved in his pick and roll game last year in attacking the rim and making decisions. Like, I want to see what happens if you give Colin Sexton a whole lot of space that he just frankly has not been able to enjoy his entire career. Sure. I think Sexton has been limited in how much he has been able to deploy his fanatic rim pressuring style for a guy who it doesn't play above the rim. He needs a little bit more space to do what he wants to do, where it's more of a speed under the rim type of thing. And yeah, we've seen Sexton be able to be above the rim occasionally, but he is a guy who wants to blow by guys and get the ball immediately out of his hands for a blazing layup. That is what he prefers to do. And I think he's been stuck in a morass of bodies because he's come across weak screens. That matters, man. And I'm excited to perhaps see Eubanks mash one out for him. Don't really need to worry about if Eubanks is gonna survive the trade deadline or not, but he is an interesting salary level. His point where you could combine him with a couple of the pieces to maybe get involved with another prospect trade. So I would not be stunned to see Eubanks off the team by the trade deadline, but not really. No one's really actively trying to trade for him because he's not like a New Orleans or a New York who desperately need center help right now. I think they could be interested in a guy like Eubanks, but they need starter level centers, and you're not exactly trading for Drew Eubanks to help win you a playoff series.
Right.
So that's kind of my idea. If he's part of the next title run for the Jazz, I hope that would be interesting if Eubanks is around in 4 years, or something odd will happen. So
unless he's in the Udonis Haslem role in 4 years,
Yeah, it's
camp counselor.
I just like the idea of Drew Eubanks being around because again, it's like I tend to not enjoy opponent shit talkers very much because I think they bog down the game. They're very annoying. There's something hilarious about Eubanks that I've enjoyed for years, and I'm really looking forward to just kind of having him around. And now in media days coming up, I really don't know much about him as a person, so I'm excited to have our great media folks interview him and get to know more about him. Next one is a little bit more exciting, I think, at least to talk about, but also I don't think we need to go too deep on it because it was a late first round pick. Isaiah Collier, 29th pick this year, point guard out of USC, who many projected to be drafted way, way higher. Extremely good pedigree coming out of high school and had a very struggling season for USC alongside Bronny James. But that USC team was flawed in 1,000 respects, and he didn't exhibit a lot of on-court performance that made you turn your head. But he still has a lot of the aspects that made a lot of people think that he would be a late lottery or a mid first round pick. He falls all the way to 29 for Utah, and this is a point guard that a lot of people want to see right away. Get minutes right away. Be on the big club right away. I don't want to preface my thoughts too much, but I think fans should qualify what it means to have a good season for a late first-round pick point guard who might struggle at first because that's what young point guards do. So I have my ideas of a good season that are a little bit more muted than I think most, and I suspect you feel the same about a young point guard late first-round pick, Dan.
Oh, I do. He's not going to add 5 wins to the Jazz's win total this season or next season. Just, guys who are drafted 29th don't do that, especially point guards who are drafted 29th. What I will say is that he is, a quote unquote real point guard, and the Jazz don't really have any of those other than a 37-year-old Australian guy who, is mostly here to be another merit badge counselor. So, I told you before that I have not like a Cody Williams level exuberance about Collier. I am appropriately muted about Collier, but I do think there's a universe where he plays because he does specific shit that not a lot of Jazz players can do. It kind of reminds me of going back 20 years. It reminds me of when we were sitting around message boards debating Carlos Arroyo or Raul Lopez in 2003, 2004, because Carlos Arroyo was a player who was an undeniably better, just, pure basketball player at that point in time. But Raul Lopez and him basically split minutes at the position because Raul Lopez did specific stuff that Jerry Sloan needed people to do. And that wasn't Carlos Arroyo's natural inclination. So they wound up a lot of games. Carlos Arroyo would play the first and third quarters in their entirety. Raul Lopez would play the second and fourth. I'm not saying that we're going to get to a point where Keontae George is splitting point guard duty down the middle with Isaiah Collier. If that happens, it's probably been a pretty disappointing year for Keontae. But I do think that Collier is going to, he has a chance to play if he can just do point guard stuff. But probably for that to work, and so this is where I finally come in for a landing and answer your question, Mark, is I think that for him to make sense as a solution in X number of minutes a game, he probably has to shoot a little better than he shot in college. So the one thing I sort of halfway care about statistically for him in terms of a good season is, he was a 33% three-point shooter in college, worse than that off the bounce. And I think as a point guard, you have to have some off the bounce game in the modern NBA, or else guys are just going under every time. And then your pick and roll game isn't generating the same stuff that it would generate otherwise. So that's probably my one thing that I would say is a good season, is just him having the confidence to let 3 or 4 3-pointers a game fly and, hopefully make 35, 36, 37% of them.
Yeah, he showed the ability to get them up in Summer League, which is always a great indicator of future success, is just your willingness and ability to get the shots up, which is harder than you'd think for a lot of these NBA prospects, is just having that comfort to do so. And I think what I meant by my opener about Isaiah Collier is because of the dearth of quality Jazz players, a lot of fans are going to want to see him get 12 minutes a game right away. And that is just not in the cards.
And he might not.
I absolutely do not think he will with the players in front of him.
Keontae, Sexton, Clarkson are all 28 minutes per game players, unless and until Clarkson is traded it is really hard to find minutes for guards on this team.
Absolutely, and that's where I think it is entirely reasonable for half of the season to be spent in the G League framing what an NBA offense looks like. The point of the G League is not necessarily like, oh, grow individual prospects, but it's also about you put NBA offenses in a G League context. It's very rare you'll see a G League team just saying like, F it, we're gonna do our own thing and try to win in our own way to our own talent. You are trying to deploy in offenses and defenses that make sense at the pro level, compared to college, for instance, where college is just you're playing with so many players who will go pro in something other than sports, right? And you can deploy offenses and defenses in unusual ways. You're trying to do pro level offense in defense in the G League, and I think that will be very valuable for him. And so a good season is like, okay, when Jordan Clarkson is off this team halfway through the year or whatever, maybe he's on the team but playing fewer minutes, or just has a fake injury or whatever. Isaiah Collier comes in, looks like he's deploying the skills that he learned in the G League, gets up the 3-point shot, shoots 35%, and so you can look at him and say, okay, like, you'll be our backup point guard next year, or you'll be part of the guard rotation next year, and we'll see where you go from there. A lot of pedigree to be excited about. I don't think we're going to see a lot of it, and I'd be excited just to see what happens in February playing alongside some of Utah's more quality players. And that being said, a bad season if he just doesn't see the floor at all. Like, just because I'm muting his impact early does not mean that I suggest that, well, it's okay if he just redshirts a year. No, this is with the quality of the Jazz roster, he should play this year at some point. I'm just foreseeing more of a Taylor Hendricks progression of minutes, not quality, but the minutes that Taylor Hendricks played last year. That's kind of what I'm seeing Isaiah Collier will end up in for the year. But if we're getting to the end of the season and he's playing 20, 25 minutes and it looks miserable out there, and we're kind of playing some more random players or some random off-the-street prospect kind of guys that were in the G League or whatever instead of Collier, that's on the table. And I think as a rookie, he at least should be able to get on the floor in February, March, April, and get 20 minutes a game and shoot okay. And if he's not doing that, it's a problem.
Yeah, you're right. I also probably won't freak out for either of these last two guys, Collier, or we're going to talk about Johnny Juzang next. Like, for either guy, I have a hard time imagining, like, on the worst case scenario side, an outcome that really changes the way I think about them. I think this is a placeholder season for both guys. I do agree that, like, when he gets on the floor, you want him to look like he is starting to process the NBA. But beyond that, there's not a ton I want from Collier. I do think that there is a scenario where, at some point he overtakes Keontae George, not as a talent, not as a basketball player, but where, next season, 2 seasons away, 3 seasons away, where Collier is the guy who actually handles the ball in certain situations because he's more of a capital P point, capital G guard. But,
a bad comparison would be like Lonzo Ball and Zach LaVine. Like when Chicago really had it going, right? You both are obvious ball handlers, but you're relying on LaVine to do more combo guardy scoring type stuff, and Lonzo Ball is just that brilliant passer. Obviously, Keontae George and Isaiah Collier have a long ways to go for those guys, but that is the relationship that you're talking about.
Right. So with that said, I have spent 0 seconds of my life thinking about which lineups I want to see Isaiah Collier exist in. I guess, and then to answer the question about, like, does he survive the trade deadline? One thing, and maybe this is really the true answer to a bad season. Like, one thing that's different about the Ainge Zanuck regime from the Lindsey Zanuck regime is, like, and I almost mentioned this when we were talking about Hendricks, like, Ochai Agbaji got traded midway through his second season. like I think the Jazz right now are pretty interested in generating more swings, and that makes them more willing to, move on from someone if the projection starts to say, hey, this guy probably isn't going to be something special. So let's just go get another pick. And even if it winds up being a late pick, actually Collier was selected with the Ochai Agbaji pick. So it kind of makes my point for me that, like, he at least has to do enough to keep Ainge and Zanuck thinking, that there might be something there. I still don't think they trade him midway through his rookie season. Although, to your point, this is a guy who, in the very early mock drafts. So, like, if you were looking in 2023 at the early 2024 mock drafts, Isaiah Collier was looking like he might be on the way to being a top 10 pick.
Top 5. He was in the top 5 for a lot of drafts.
Right, which tells you that, like, there are probably some GMs out there that still kind of have a soft spot, and that, if, like, he wouldn't be the central part of any trade package for anything super meaningful. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the one scenario where he's packing his bags at some point this year, is if someone who liked him but just couldn't bring themselves to pull the trigger in the mid-teens calls the Jazz and says, yeah, whatever, we'll give you so-and-so for John Collins if you'll include Isaiah Collier, whatever.
That's a great point, and it requires Isaiah Collier to having some sort of modest success in the G League or with the big club. I really don't know how to approach rookies at the first, in their first year as far as the trade deadline. But I definitely want to see him with the other rookies, man. Like, I want to see a lineup where he's playing with Cody Williams and Kyle Filipowski. It'll be very bad basketball, but I want to see the rookies together, man. Like, that's kind of just what I want to see. Not for any particular basketball element, but just like a cool thing I want to see on the floor at some point. Hopefully not just in April. Hopefully we get a point in December where those three are on the floor with two other quality players, and it's like, oh, the rookies they're playing. And they're playing actual NBA minutes and with good players because nobody's hurt. That is a cool thing I want to see, even if the basketball on the floor might not be particularly relevant. Hard to see if he'll be part of the next title run, but maybe he will be the point guard of the future. And the last guy we'll talk about today, surprising two-way signing who became a full roster signing by the Jazz. Johnny Juzang, which was kind of came out of nowhere as a two-way signing in the past for Utah, had a kind of an up and down G League performances. I loved seeing his. He had a couple amazing performances for the Stars, but not consistently dominant. And when he played with the big club, Juzang was okay. He had, I think, one terrific shooting game, and the rest were just kind of nondescript. But he parlayed that into a 4-year, $12 million contract, noting that only the first year of that is a guaranteed contract for this year. But he has a real-ass NBA contract as a deep threat shooting guard who is limited athletically, doesn't exactly have a whole lot of ball handling or passing chops, but might have potential there, and is a total question mark defensively. I'll say question mark as a charitable kind of gift to him.
Sure.
Why was there a guaranteed contract on the floor for Juzang? And that means that I'm asking you in that way because why would the Jazz see a good season out of him coming up this year that they think is worth that guaranteed money?
Well, it's a real-ass NBA contract because he has one real-ass NBA skill. And in today's NBA environment, if you have one thing that you do at the NBA level pretty elitely, you can make a little bit of money. He's a shooter. He was a 42% three-point shooter last year. The Jazz think that they can maximize that even a little bit more. You usually, in order to like actually play in the NBA, you have to develop a second and a third and a fourth NBA skill at some point. But he is, he's a real shooter, and that's why he's interesting. The other thing I'll say is, again, we were talking about this with Eubanks. The Jazz probably didn't need to pay Eubanks more than the minimum in order to beat out other offers. I don't know who else was lining up to pay Eubanks more than the minimum, but because they gave him extra money on the front end, they got a non-guaranteed second year. With Johnny Juzang, they really didn't go over his minimum by they went exactly $1 million over his what would have been his minimum salary, and in exchange for that, they got 3 team control years that are totally non-guaranteed, and then the 4th year is a team option that is still non-guaranteed after the team option is exercised. So, not a lot of risk here. I think, and this is at a point when the Jazz were still trying to figure out how they were going to get it to the $126.5 million salary floor. It's like they had to pay someone. They threw him an extra $1 million, and now they get to see if that shooting is going to hold up from last year and if he can add other stuff. I think the only way he really fights his way into the rotation is if his defense significantly improves. So that probably answers the good season question. And, a bad season would be him bouncing back to the 24% he shot as a rookie. Now that was in spot minutes, and it's kind of unfair to look at a guy's, shot percentages when he's playing 3 minutes here and 4 minutes there and garbage time almost all the time. But that's a pretty bad outcome, because this is a player who needs to be hitting shots in order to have NBA value and be interesting to an NBA coach.
I think I was more perplexed at the contract for Juzang, if only because we've been fortunate enough as Jazz fans to see Utah bring in random guys off the street we've never heard of and have them succeed. The Royce O'Neals, the Joe Ingles of the world, where I was always kind of Simone Fontecchio. I've always kind of looked forward to say, okay, if this is a team with these 3 or 4 roster spots at the end of the roster, and we're not trying to sign any actual good free agents here. We had our big free agent podcast where we talked about all the options. We immediately started talking about random bench guys, right? We weren't talking about stars. And so I was always hoping all right, let's find random guys who've been in the EuroLeague for a little while, or random guys who kind of bounced around and we don't know anything about them. So signing a known quantity just felt kind of a letdown for me. But that being said, he absolutely can shoot the lights out. And if he's a movement shooter, then that is going to, again, enhance practices. That's going to enhance the development of the better prospects on the team. And he can be on the floor as, if Jordan Clarkson is injured or doesn't have it, you can put Juzang at the 2 and just say, look, you are the spacer, right? If Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks, as they're kind of learning how to space the floor in their roles, right? And if Lauri Markkanen is not on the floor and John Collins is his 3-point shooting is not improved, well, you need spacing out there to help guys like Keontae George and Isaiah Collier learn how to play the game a little bit. And Juzang is a guy you can, no questions, put out there, and defenses immediately have to say, well, that guy is going to shoot. Also, Juzang has a little bit of above the rim juice. He's kind of not the best athlete in the world, but he can get above the rim a little bit. So, okay, there's a little bit of pop there, and we'll see what happens. And maybe there is an NBA future for him. But yeah, I have thoughts on lineups for every player. He is the one guy that I'm just I don't know, man. Just space the floor with whomever.
Well, so he's 6'7", but I think his natural position is shooting guard. So he's got good size at shooting guard. I also think that Lauri, if you want to put Lauri in a position where you just throw him, you run a little, 1-3 screen out front to get Lauri the ball at the nail, and you're just going to let Lauri go to work at the nail, then you have to have guys on the wings who defenses can't sag off of even a little bit, because otherwise it's just too easy to crowd Lauri there. So I think a player like Juzang gets interesting in that regard. Now, I also don't want to overstate this, because it's very possible we get to the end of the season and Markkanen and Juzang have played 100 minutes together. I don't think that that's going to be a major thing, but I just think that having a shooter that defenses know about, does change things, does make things a little more interesting for, you mentioned Colin Sexton never really operating with much space in his career. Jordan Clarkson, as long as he's on the Jazz, his little carve his way to the rim drives, Lauri operating from the elbow, whatever it is. But I do think, having said that in the same breath, obviously Juzang's probably most likely path to minutes is that, Jordan Clarkson is forwarding his mail by February, but we'll see if that happens.
Yeah, we've implicated Jordan Clarkson being traded 1,000 times on this podcast.
Poor guy.
But
Poor guy. What a bunch of dicks we are. We're just sitting here like,
look, I've pre-written an ode to Jordan Clarkson that I will publish if and when he gets traded, and I will show for our video viewers that he is still my phone background. That because he is I think he's the coolest guy. I really love Jordan Clarkson. I think he's an incredible player, and I love that he also chose. Speaking of cool guys who choose Utah, but
Yeah.
it's a square peg in a round hole with the current Jazz roster, and we didn't exactly love his performance on the court last year. So and also like it's blocking minutes, right, for Collier, for Keontae George, and for Johnny Juzang. So it's kind of like it's kind of disappointing there as a fan aspect. Which, by the way, we didn't get into this, but one of our favorite topics that we should get into when we talk about some of our other young players is the concept of blocking minutes, right? And what that it could actually mean, whether it helps or hurts a young player to just see the floor. And when we talk about young players seeing the floor, I want them to be surrounded by players that will actually enhance their learning and not just be thrown out there with bad teams. So
sure.
That's when we talk about Jordan Clarkson blocking minutes. Well, I don't want that to mean like, okay, that means Isaiah Collier is just playing with he's playing with garbage. It's more like, okay, if Isaiah Collier or Johnny Juzang is getting those minutes instead of Jordan Clarkson from day one, well, that means there's perhaps a quality team around him. So something to talk about in our later episodes. But you fans got 90 minutes of 5 players to talk about. And I feel like if we get
we're really sick, Mark.
Look, if you get under 90 minutes, I feel like that's as healthy as you can expect from the diehards. And look, the way I want to craft these episodes, Dan, is that we'll hook you for the first hour with 2 players you really, really care about, and then the sickos can continue listening for the Drew Eubanks and the Johnny Juzang discussion. So you can choose your own adventure and how you listen or watch to this particular episode. But that's we'll do another one of these for another 5 guys.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mark Russell Pereira, for joining us. I'm Dan Clayton. He's Mark Russell Pereira. From opposite sides of the Rocky Mountains, bringing you some Jazz analysis as training camp is just days away. Thanks for joining us. This has been another Salt City Hoops podcast /video.